I'm Scott Chacon, CEO of GitButler. Today on part 2 of doing a CLI in Rust with Caleb, we're going to be doing some lightsabering.
Oh!
Cheers. All right, bring us home.
So the first thing that we want to do is we want to define a structure that defines a wine tasting. So let's say struct wine has got a name, which is a string, and has a liked or rating. That's a
Integer.
which is a float of 32 bits.
Float.
Indeed, it might be a 2.5. In order to be able to serialize and deserialize this, we want to say derive, and we'll say serialize and deserialize. And what my editor has gone and done is it's gone and imported these two traits.
Thank you, VS
from
Codium.
the third library. So thank you very much to Rust Analyzer for importing those for me.
It seems like an unfortunate name.
What we want to do is let's just assume that we have a certain location that this is stored. So I'm going to make two functions. So the first one will be read storage. And what I'm going to say is this is going to return a result. So usually in Rust, if you've got a result, you have to specify what the error variant is. However, with the anyhow library, this wrapper around errors that sort of allows you to have any form of error within reason. So it allows us to only specify the positive variant. So what I'm going to say here is, if I read the storage, I want to get a vector of wines. So what we can do here is, let's assume that the wine is stored at a fixed location on my hard drive. So let's say, contents. So I want to read a file off disk. So I'm going to say the contents of the file should be std://fs read to string. And what this does is it takes a file path and just reads the entire contents as a string.
Also do some JSON file.
Yeah, so let's just do like /tmp/wines.json, right?
Perfect.
And usually this gives us a error type, right? So this is some like IO result. And in past episodes, we've called like the .unwrap function. But with the anyhow library, we can use the question mark operator to coerce this into the anyhow result type. In order to read the contents of this file, we've got this read to string function.
Right.
So this gives us just a string. But we assume this is like a JSON object. But what we need to do is actually parse this into some JSON that the rest of the code can use.
The question mark, instead of unwrap at this point on the read to string, is let's say this file doesn't exist.
Yes.
And so now it has an error, right?
Yes.
Like this file doesn't fucking exist.
Yes.
Normally, if you unwrap, it will panic, right? Because it's like, now there's an error instead of a string that comes out. And so now I'm going to panic and like have a bad error state. Question mark says there's a result that comes out that says there's an error message as a result instead of a string as a result, right? Or a vector of wines as a result. And so now the thing that is above this can deal with this rather than us dealing with it here.
Yeah.
Okay. So I feel like that's important because it took me a while to kind of figure out the difference between like an unwrapped and a question mark. But like, in order to do a question mark, you have to return a result because it will return a result of either it's okay or it's a problem.
Yeah.
And you deal with it upstream.
Yeah. So I've read the contents from a string, and we want to ask Surge to parse this into this format. So I've already specified, like, this is the wine structure. Right. So I want to be able to just ask Surd, can you give me a list of this? Can you try and parse this string that we have and turn it into a list of this format? What I'm going to do is I'm going to say contents. And from the outside, like if you're doing Ruby or if you're doing JavaScript, it might be bizarre to see let contents
twice,
followed by let contents. But Rust has this idea of shadowing a variable where you say, whenever I redefine content, ignore the last version of it. This is what the identifier now points to. So I'm going to say let contents equals surd JSON : from stir. I'm going to say give it the old contents, right? And I'm going to use the question mark colon as well, because, you know, the from stir is something that could fail, but I'm going to say, I don't really care. You deal with that. And
because of the way we're writing it, it will come back as a vector of wines.
Yeah. So what I'm going to say is OK contents. What we see here is now that the type checker says this is all good. If I use my cursor to hover over here, it's figured out that this contents is a vector of wine. We don't have any like type annotations here, right? But that's because the Rust compiler is able to infer the types. So if this was like C++, we would need some like sort of template to specify this is a vector of wines. But because the Rust compiler is so powerful, it's able to infer that for us. And because our wine structure implements the serialize and deserialize, it all checks out for us. And sort of quickly, I'm going to implement the parallel. So I'm going to say function write storage, which will take a wines.
A new wine.
Which will be a slice. So a slice is like a vector, but it's...
Well, I mean, you want to write one wine, right?
I'm going to write an entire storage of wines.
Okay.
So this will be
So you're going to read it, add one, and then write the whole array back.
Exactly.
Okay, fair enough.
So this will also be a result, but I'm going to just do the unit type. So this basically signals, did it work or did it fail? So I'm going to say let contents again, but this time I'm going to say surd JSON, and I'm going to say toString, and I'm going to say let's be a toString of the wines that I passed in.
So what we're going to do is you're going to add a wine. We're going to say, here's the wine. You're going to read storage, add something to the array.
Yeah.
And then write storage back.
Yes.
So that it writes it back again.
Yeah.
We just need to say, here's the name and the rating, right?
Exactly.
Like throw it onto the end of the vector.
Yeah. So with the flow of the add command, we're going to, first of all, read all of the existing wines.
And surd does all this for us. Like just figures out how, here's a string and an integer or whatever, or a float.
Yeah.
And like I'll figure out how to get it to and from this JSON sort of structure.
Yeah.
Is surd the main way that this is done in Rust, or are there other sort of like ways to serialize and deserialize stuff?
Surd is the main library when it comes to serializing and deserializing data. So what they've done is they've come up with this like common set of like macros that can be used. And that provides like this universal interface that you can then use to have your own like YAML serializer or deserializer, or your own TOML serializer, deserializer. So a library can say, this is serializable, and you as a consumer can decide what exactly you want that format to end up being.
Why do you have to, in a macro, derive serialize and deserialize if in the function you're saying, like specifically, I'm serializing and deserializing JSON from this struct to a thing, right? Like it should, can it not fucking figure out that it's a struct that goes into JSON and comes out of JSON?
So with a language like Ruby, you're able to sort of introspect, like what sort of properties does a given object have? By default, Rust doesn't have that sort of introspection. What these deserialized and serialized objects provide, macros, thank you, they provide methods that are behind the scenes that allow other portions of the code to iterate over the properties that are in that particular structure.
Okay.
What I want to do is I want to have my storage layer. So this, reads from disk, and reasonably this writes to the disk. So basically I'm saying everything that is passed in, I want to convert it to a string.
Right.
And then I just want to say std, stdfs, and I can say write, and this will reasonably write to a given path the contents. So I'm going to pass in tmp/wines.json. So this is the same path. We could have this be like
a variable,
or something.
Fair enough.
Doesn't matter. And I'm going to say, once this is done, let's just return this OK unit type to say everything succeeded. Woo! So now we've got these like primitives in place, we can start implementing the actual subcommands. So the first thing that I want to do is implement read.
No, you want to add first. You got to add something to it to list.
Okay, so the first thing I want to add is add, because my boss is a, tyrannical leader.
Complete douchebag.
Yeah, something like that.
Add wine.
So let's implement the add function. So for the add function, we want to reasonably have the name of the wine. So we're going to pass that in as a stir. And we want to have, what was it? The frickin' rating.
Yeah, the rating.
The rating, which is a
float for some reason. So
let's make an add function.
What we do, we read, and then we add, and then we write.
Yeah. So what we want to do is we're going to say, let's read the storage. So reasonably, we'll call the read storage function.
What happens if it's the first thing?
So in this case, if it's the first thing, we expect the read to fail because the file doesn't exist. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say unwrap or, and what this does is it lets me say, if the storage read fails, let me provide this other value instead. So in this case, I'm just going to say, if the read fails,
an empty vector.
Provide an empty vector or an empty list. Right. And then I'm going to say my storage, and I'm going to push on a new item, and this is going to be a new wine. And I'm going to provide the name and the rating of this new wine. So this dot push says add this to the existing list. And something important is that this, first of all, needs to be mutable, right? So I've read this, and this is now a mutable variable. And the value that we pass into this add function is a borrowed type, but we want to store a owned type. So I'm going to say name is actually name.into, which will convert it to an owned string.
Why does the string have to be into and the rating does not?
In Rust, there are two properties that a given type can have. The first one is copy, which is a very explicit take this and duplicate it. And typically this is done if the operation is relatively more expensive. So if I've got a string, that might be like, 100 bytes in memory. If you were to copy that, that's relatively expensive. If you have something that is relatively easy to duplicate, i.e. a F32, because that's only going to be 32 bytes, that is often categorized under the copy trait. The copy basically says, if this needs to be duplicated, just do it without asking me. Because this F32 is much easier to duplicate, is copied automatically, whereas the name needs to be cloned. Because the clone is much more expensive, we need to explicitly say to the language, please do that for me.
All right, fair enough.
It was a good question.
Yeah.
I'm going to say
add it
right to the storage, and I say let's pass in a reference to the storage. question mark colon, and I'm going to say print line added Scots next wine.
Shit.
And because this function expects to return result,
Okay.
we'll say okay like that.
Okay.
Then for the listing functionality that we started with, we'll say fn list, which doesn't need to take any arguments. This will similarly return a result because of how we're working with the any library. So I'm going to say let storage equals read storage question mark colon. So this gives me all of the wines in existence.
Right.
And I'm going to say, let's make a for loop, right? So that wasn't for, that's for wine in storage. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be very basic, like print line.
Right.
And this has a
wine dot something
template string. So I'm going to say wine and then like expect a variable.
Right.
Followed by rating, colon, and then another variable. And then I can just in here say like wine dot name, comma, wine dot rating, and this will print out the various wines that we have.
Perfect.
And then we can hook this up to the actual parser itself.
So okay, fair enough.
For the list, we can say just
list. Easy enough.
Which is easy enough. We'll put a question mark there.
Why
We've
not?
got the result type here. So the whole point of the anyhow library is that like these errors just propagate upwards, right? Which makes it very easy. For add, we want to add some like sub flags.
Right.
So we'll say name is a string and rating is a F32. And we'll say clap brackets short equals n to be short for name, and clap short r. Now that I've added these properties to the add variant, when I'm doing my match statement, I can say, now that I'm doing this add match, I can access the name and I can access the rating.
You added to the call.
Yeah, so I can now say add, and I can pass in the name and rating.
Right.
And this.
Why is list mad? Why is name mad?
I don't fucking know.
Oh.
So firstly,
ampersand string instead of string.
Yeah. So add expects a reference to a string, so we just need to reference the owned object.
Yeah.
List, on the other hand. Oh, right. So I forgot a question mark. There we go.
Yeah, that's it.
So
now we're good.
Now I can say
cargo build
run.
Nope. Okay.
Dash dash, and I can say dash dash help, and this will say now you've got these two commands.
Add and list.
So I can can even say dash dash add dash dash help, and it will say.
This is pretty cool, actually.
Oh yeah, the clap library does a really good job of like creating this documentation for you, which is incredibly helpful.
Right.
If I added doc strings to my Rust structure, so if I went in here and for add I say like triple dash, which is a Rust doc string, and say this will add a new wine. If I rerun the help command, it will actually now annotate the add.
How cool is that?
It's incredibly cool. It's very helpful.
Super cool.
Let's finish this off by actually adding a wine.
Yeah, let's add a wine.
Let's add whatever this bottle was. I
thought we were gonna do the other one, but okay, the big boy.
Hyper
modestete.
I broke a window with this one. So add -n. What is this called? Hyper. This one's hyper, and the rating is a 5. So we see that it now says added Scott's next wine.
Sure, and then we say cargo one list
run dash list, and it lists out wine hyper has a rating of 5.
One more. What was the red wine? All right, Albi's Drift, 4.8
we go.
All right. And then list.
Woo!
Oh, there it is. There it is. Well done, sir. Well done. We're running cargo run to do this thing. But if you build it and you create a CLI, then you would just do like wino list or wino add or whatever, right?
So
like
I could compile this to be like a binary with any name you wanted.
Right.
And I could share that binary with you, and you could run it locally as well, right?
Right.
So there's no need for like having the Rust compiler installed or anything, right? Which is the beauty of having a compiled language, right? Thank you for going through this process of learning clap and surd with me. I hope you found something valuable out of this. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you enjoyed this, feel free to leave a like.
Cheers.